We're seeing gold in the box, and these boxes are gigantic. I mean, even though you're seeing just a few specks, you know there's a lot of gold in there.
Shawn Pomrenke's $800,000 dredge was built for one thing: pulling gold, nothing else. But during a routine night run, the Myrtle Irene struck the unexpected. The sonar pinged with a strange return. The buckets hauled up material no one recognized, and within minutes, the deck was alive with tension. This wasn't pay dirt. It was something that didn't belong on the seafloor. The crew moved fast, pulling it from the rest of the load, unsure if they'd just hit the jackpot or opened a nightmare. What happened next had the power to flip the entire season on its head. In Nome, you don't get to choose what the sea gives you. You just pray it isn't the thing that sinks you. The Bering Sea doesn't forgive. One wrong gamble tonight could make or break Shawn Pomrenke's empire. Before we dive in, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to see will have you gripping the edge of your seat. The numbers told their own story, scrawled across Shawn's weathered ledger like slow-motion disaster. 2 weeks, that's all he had before the next wave of payments landed: overdue claim fees, debt collectors, and high-interest contracts that didn't wait. Miss just one, and the whole operation would start to unravel. Payroll, fuel, parts, everything hanging by a thread. The world still saw Mr. Gold, the swaggering Nome legend, but every ounce of gold already had a place to go before it even touched the sluice. Keeping the Christine Rose alive, the crew fed, and machines patched together with more grit than steel. The season was slipping away. Soon storms would hammer the coast, and ice would choke the shoreline. Once that happened, no one would touch the gold-rich ground until next spring. Every cold gust felt like the clock ticking. The Christine Rose, his loyal but aging workhorse, wasn't enough anymore, not with the hole he was in. And that's when the dangerous idea hit him. A dredge, bigger than anything he'd ever run, left to rot, written off as scrap. But if he could resurrect it, it could pull more gold in one tide than the Christine Rose could in an entire week. It was a crazy idea, exactly the kind he'd built his name on. The Myrtle Irene sat hunched on the shoreline, her massive frame sagging into the sand as if she'd been trying to sink into obscurity. Salt had eaten deep scars into her hull. Streaks of rust ran like dried blood down her flanks. Her name was barely legible beneath layers of peeling paint. To most, she was a corpse, a floating coffin whose engines had died years ago and whose bones had been picked clean by weather and time. Locals shook their heads when they saw her. "Scrap her," they'd say. "She'll take you down with her." They spoke of past seasons where she'd burned through fuel faster than she could shovel gold, where her unstable decks had pitched operators dangerously close to the sea. She was too big, too clumsy, too far gone. Shawn didn't say a word as he walked her length, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He didn't see a coffin, he saw a warship. In his mind, systems came apart piece by piece. The wash plant repositioned, the sluice redesigned, pumps gutted and replaced. He could almost hear her engines roaring again, see her shadow moving across the water like a predator. But seeing it in your head is one thing. Making it happen meant putting every last dime on the table. He liquidated savings, maxed out credit cards, walked into banks and signed his name to high-interest loans that would bury him if the gamble failed. By the time the deals were done, $800,000 was tied up in a rusting hulk that might never float again. If the Myrtle Irene went down, she wouldn't just take his money, she'd take his title, his fleet, and the legacy he'd built in Nome. The first step was bringing her back from the dead, and the sea wasn't about to make it easy. Steel work came first. Under a punishing wind, crews cut away rotted hull plates the size of truck beds, replacing them with gleaming sheets of fresh steel. Sparks showered into the sand as welders stitched her seams shut again. Each new plate was a lifeline, and each one came with a bill Shawn had no choice but to pay. The wash plant was next. The Myrtle's original design had been a disaster for operators, excavator arms swinging blind, dropping buckets into the sea instead of the hopper. Shawn tore it apart and lowered the entire system several feet, giving operators a clean line of sight to every load of pay dirt. He added something the old Myrtle never had, a second sluice line running parallel to the first. It wasn't for the big nuggets. This one was designed to catch the microscopic gold flakes that older rigs simply lost overboard. In a season where every speck mattered, it could mean the difference between survival and bankruptcy. Then came the guts: pumps, hoses, generators. Anything with a bearing or a seal was pulled, rebuilt, or replaced outright. Shawn knew that in the Bering Sea, a $10 hose could fail and cost you $50,000 in lost. There was no margin for good enough. The crew worked in shifts that blurred into each other, the line between day and night erased by the relentless drive to make her seaworthy. Rain blew sideways in sheets, soaking through gloves and jackets. The cold bit into hands until they went numb on steel rails. But they kept going, torchlight flickering against the Myrtle's rising frame. Every hour cost more than Shawn wanted to admit. And yet, he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Not with the sea season shrinking by the day, and not with $800,000 chained to a machine that had to prove it could earn her keep or destroy him trying. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the night they pushed her back into the water would mark a turn, one no one, least of all him, was ready for. Midnight over the Bering Sea didn't soften that feeling, it sharpened it. The black, heavy sky pressed low, damp air beading on the railings, the water whispering beneath the dock with a slow, frigid menace. No one spoke as the Myrtle Irene was eased in. No champagne bottles swung, no newspaper cameras flashed. This wasn't a celebration. It was an execution of necessity, and every man on board felt the same truth. Failure here wouldn't just sink the dredge, it could sink them. The Myrtle Irene, rebuilt piece by piece after months of grueling labor, was not heading for some easy, shallow scrape of sand. Her target was an old honey hole Shawn had worked in whispers about for years, a patch of seabed that sat 30-plus feet under, a place where the water pressure made lesser rigs groan and collapse. If gold still lay there, it would be heavy, trapped deep under layers of stubborn clay. If not, the dredge would chew through diesel and steel for nothing. Shawn stood near the bow, hands clamped white on the rail, eyes locked on the horizon that had long since vanished into black. The crane swung the excavator bucket out over the water, its metal teeth glinting under the deck lights before plunging into the void below. The sound was swallowed instantly, replaced by the low churn of pumps and the rhythmic hiss of hydraulic lines. The dredge shuddered, not from failure, but from the weight of work beginning. Time passed slowly, measured in coffee mugs drained, and the muffled clank of metal shifting somewhere deep in the hull. Crew members worked in near silence, heads bent over gauges and levers, ears tuned for the hiss of escaping air or the scream of a slipping belt. None came, the belts held, the hoses stayed tight, the engines rumbled like something alive and old enough to remember its purpose. For a maiden voyage in these waters, it was uncanny. Machines here had a habit of breaking early and breaking big. Tonight, though, the Myrtle Irene moved like she'd been born to it. Even Shawn, who trusted machines about as far as he could throw them, allowed himself a slow breath. Hours later, the first sign of life from the seabed came. Not gold, but clay. Thick, heavy slabs of it, the kind miners love, because it clings to gold the way frost clings to glass. The excavator bucket dumped it onto the deck in wet, grey heaps, and the crew's energy shifted. Heads turned, eyes narrowed. This was the right kind of mess. Shawn began pacing. He had a predator's restlessness, the habit of movement when the stakes got high. His boots thudded softly against the deck as his ears hunted for trouble. In the background noise, a whine too high, a clank too sharp. Every vibration came under suspicion. Then, from the sluice box, a voice cut through the night. "Hey, look at this." The words were quiet, but the tone was unmistakable. Heads snapped toward the sluice. Under the deck lights, caught in the slow, deliberate wash of water, tiny sparks winked back. Gold. Not flakes dulled by sand, but sharp, glittering specks. The kind you could pluck out and feel the weight of between your fingers. The sluice was catching it, really catching it. The new design, untested before tonight, wasn't flushing it back into the sea. For the first time in weeks, Shawn's shoulders loosened. No smile. He wasn't built for those on the job, but his jaw unclenched. Around him, the crew let out the kind of small exhalations that pass for celebration at sea. A few claps on the back, a nod. Nobody said it, but the thought was there. Maybe, just maybe, this gamble wasn't suicide. But the sea doesn't give without taking, and Myrtle Irene was a hungry thing. The diesel tanks dropped faster than anyone liked, gallons vanishing with the steady thump of the engines. Thousands of dollars in fuel gone each day, the numbers adding up faster than the gold in the sluice. The Bering Sea didn't care about gold. It demanded its own toll in cash, steel, and blood. Saltwater made its first move within days. Freshly welded steel began to bloom with orange rust in the corners where hands couldn't reach with a brush. Electronics, sealed tight on land, began to sweat inside their casings. The hoses, thick and reinforced, still groaned under the constant grind of sand and gravel, their black skins wearing thin where they flexed most. Every time a part failed, the cost wasn't just money, it was hours, sometimes days, of downtime. And downtime in the Bering Sea is its own kind of death sentence. The crew wages, the insurance premiums, the endless stream of groceries and supplies, all of it burned through cash like paper in a fire. Each day without production was another notch closer to the point where even gold couldn't save them. Shawn knew the math better than anyone. This wasn't just a gold hunt, it was a sprint against financial starvation. The Myrtle Irene could be perfect, the gold could flow, but if they couldn't outrun the costs, they'd still lose. And here, on the dark water under a sky empty of stars, he knew one thing with perfect clarity. The dredge wasn't the only thing at risk of sinking. That fear wasn't his alone. Every pan of concentrate, every small glint in the sluice box was a reminder of how far they still had to go, and how little time the season would give them. The Myrtle's steady trickle of gold kept the crew's spirits from collapsing entirely, but the math was brutal. What they were pulling wasn't even scratching the surface of Shawn's mounting debts. Every man aboard knew it without needing to say it. They needed a big strike, and they needed it soon. The kind of pocket that could turn weeks of scraping by into a single day of salvation. Shawn didn't just think about it, he acted. He called for a hard change in course, steering the Myrtle away from the safe, proven zones and toward an expanse of seabed no one had touched in living memory. The maps called it dead ground, but Shawn trusted something deeper than charts, a gut instinct built from decades of dredging, from learning to read the subtle patterns of currents and sediment. It was a gamble that could make or break the season. The work hours stretched into an exhausting grind, 18 hours on, a handful off, then back again. Sleep was a luxury, and food was grabbed in half-chewed bites between loads. The crew ran on adrenaline and stubbornness. Sonar sweeps and ancient half-faded charts suggested there was something here, a gold-rich layer lying dormant under a thick blanket of silt. It was like chasing a shadow. You couldn't see it, but if you were right, you'd feel it in the bucket before you saw it in the sluice. Shawn watched the excavator work in silence, listening for every groan of metal, every change in the rhythm of the pumps. The deeper they dug, the more he felt it. This was where the Myrtle was meant to be. The ocean had a way of answering decisions like this, sometimes brutally, sometimes with strange generosity. That answer came in the form of a storm. It wasn't just rough seas, it was the kind of violent, rolling chaos that churned the sea floor like a giant spoon in a pot. Sand, silt, and rocks were hurled into motion, and gold, if there was gold here, would not stay buried. Every other vessel in range made the same choice: run for port. It was the smart call, but Shawn didn't come this far to run. He ordered Myrtle into the teeth of the storm. Waves slammed her bow. Salt spray coated every inch of steel. The crew lashed themselves to their stations, knowing one slip could send a man overboard in seconds. Even shouting at full voice was useless. The wind stole words before they left your mouth. And then, as the storm raged around them, the readings began to shift. The sensors tracking density in the slurry spiked. The feed from the dredge pumps grew heavier, more sluggish, an indication they were hauling in something denser than silt. Shawn's eyes locked on the data, and a grin cut across his face. This was it. The storm wasn't a curse, it was a gift, stripping away the top layers of dead ground and laying bare what lay beneath. For the next 24 hours, no one left their post. The sluice roared, overloaded with thick, gold-rich clay. Every shovelful that dropped onto the deck was heavier than the last, clinging to gloves, boots, and steel like it didn't want to leave the ocean's grip. They ran the wash plant non-stop, pushing the Myrtle harder than they had since launch. By the time the weather eased and the sea began to settle, the crew was beyond exhaustion. Faces were raw from wind and salt. Muscles shook with every motion. But the cleanup was the kind of sight you remembered for the rest of your life. Pan after pan revealed the truth, ounces upon ounces of gold, far beyond anything they'd pulled all season. It glittered under the deck lights in fat, heavy flakes and chunks, the kind of gold you could feel drop into your palm. When they tallied the take, it was enough to erase weeks of slow bleeding in a single run. The Myrtle had taken a beating, but she had paid back the pain in gold, and Shawn knew this wasn't luck. This was instinct. And if there was one pocket out here like this, there could be more. But out on the Bering, a strike was never just a strike. It was leverage. The kind of leverage you needed when men in suits were already circling, ready to decide your fate in boardrooms, far from the cold, black water. The corporate deal had started as a handshake in a warm office, the kind where promises are poured like coffee, rich, smooth, and seemingly endless. But within months, the tone shifted. Shawn found himself signing papers he didn't entirely trust, the kind written in language that seemed harmless until lawyers made it lethal. The mega-dredge Dream, an engineering monster capable of moving more sea floor in a week than most crews managed in a season, was supposed to be his ticket to domination in Nome. The investors smiled for the cameras, called him a visionary, then slowly began tightening the noose. Control slipped away in fragments. A management oversight here, a spending approval there. Soon, he needed permission to order parts for his own project. Then the bank calls started. Assets were frozen. The Myrtle Irene's upgrades stalled mid-build, pieces of her torn apart in the Nome yard, as useless as a beached whale. By the time Shawn realized the trap, the bankruptcy filing was already in motion. And it wasn't because they were broke. The books showed profit potential in the millions. No, this was a strategic kill, the kind where vultures feed not on failure, but on the living. When the paperwork was final, Shawn stood on the dock, watching a dredge he no longer legally controlled. The sea hadn't beaten him this time. It was the boardroom sharks that had ripped him open. Millions of dollars in future gold washed away with the tide of legal rulings. In Nome, rumors swirled that it was all planned from the start. A calculated ambush to strip him of claims and machinery under the guise of partnership. Shawn didn't bother denying it. He'd been burned enough to know that the most dangerous predators wore tailored suits, not diving helmets. The fallout bled into every part of his life. Court dates and DUI charges stacked up like driftwood after a storm. The legal stress, combined with the investor betrayal, lit a slow-burning fuse inside him. Arguments with his father, already tense from years of competing visions, turned into full-blown rifts. Old mining deals were dug up, every handshake and debt between them suddenly a fresh wound. The crew, used to Shawn's sharp edges, saw something different now: volatility, an unpredictability that came from carrying too many losses too close to the chest. At sea, orders grew clipped, tempers short. A missed bolt in the sluice became a shouting match. A delay in fuel delivery turned into a threat to dock pay. Friends who had dug beside him for years began drifting away, unwilling to get caught in the rip current of his personal storms. Family ties stretched to breaking, the bonds that mining had once strengthened now fraying strand by strand. Out on the Bering Sea, where the horizon feels endless, Shawn's world had begun to close in tight. Yet for all the cracks, there were still unshakable truths. Shawn's name was carved into Nome's mining law, and his claims, those stretches of seabed that others could only fantasize about, remained in his control. Myrtle Irene, once the butt of dockside jokes, had become a machine spoken of with a mix of envy and dread. Rivals knew that if she was running at full tilt, she could strip a hotspot bare before anyone else even anchored. Each new season was a battle, but it wasn't just with the Bering Sea anymore. Rivals circled, paperwork threats loomed, and the clock always ticked louder than the pumps. Shawn understood that mining here wasn't just about gold, it was about surviving long enough to see it hauled onto your deck. For him, the gamble never stopped. Every decision was a roll of the dice, every storm a test of how much grit and nerve a man could muster before the sea or the world on shore broke him completely. The miracle, if it came, wouldn't arrive with fanfare. It would be in the shimmer of gold dust sliding down a sluice, the reading on a scale tipping heavier than expected, the rare moment when all the risk felt worth it. And as long as Myrtle's engines turned and the pumps roared, Shawn Pomrenke would be out there, still betting against the odds, still chasing the next strike that could change everything in a single tide.